The encounter at the airport should have been a fleeting moment, a ridiculous misunderstanding Haley would later laugh about in private humiliation. She should have gone home, told Ethan about the disaster, and moved on with her life. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The next day, as she stood behind the counter of Hudson Brews, the small cafe tucked in the corner of Terminal B, she was not expecting to see him again. Yet there he was, Alexander Reed, sitting at a table in the VIP section, sipping coffee like he owned the place. Well, technically, he probably did own it. Haley's grip on the tray tightened as dread coiled in her stomach. Maybe if she ignored him, he'd leave. Maybe if she avoided eye contact, he'd forget about her completely. She took a deep breath, plastered on her best customer service smile, and turned away, only for Mr. Peterson, her grumpy, impossible-to-please manager, to swoop in like a vulture. "Haley!" he hissed, barely concealing his giddiness. "Table 12, VIP client." Go. Haley's stomach plummeted. Oh no, she couldn't. Not him. Not after yesterday. I'm on break, she tried, grasping at any excuse to escape. Peterson's eyes narrowed. You take a break when I say you take a break. Fantastic. Just fantastic. With no other choice, Haley forced herself toward table 12, tray in hand, heart pounding in her ears. Alexander looked up as she approached, and the slow smile that curved his lips sent an unsettling warmth down her spine. Well, well, he mused. If it isn't my favorite accidental hugger. Haley swallowed hard. This was going to be a long shift. Haley gritted her teeth, bracing herself for the inevitable. This wasn't just a casual run-in. This was her nightmare coming back to haunt her in broad daylight. She adjusted the tray in her hands, squared her shoulders, and approached table 12 with the kind of forced confidence she reserved for the most difficult customers. Alexander Reed sat with the relaxed elegance of a man who owned the world, which in many ways he did. His gray eyes locked onto hers the second she stopped at his table. Well, well, he mused, setting his coffee cup down. Fancy meeting you here. Haley cleared her throat, willing herself to stay professional. Mr. Reed. His lips twitched. Oh, we're going with Mr. Reed now? That's a bit formal, don't you think, considering our history? History. Right. Because mistaken identity and public humiliation totally counted as history. She clenched the tray tighter. I was just delivering your order. She set the cup down as swiftly as possible, eager to get away. Hold on, he said smoothly, making no effort to dismiss her. I have a question. She resisted the urge to groan. Yes? Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Did you really mistake me for your brother? Haley stiffened. Of course I did. A knowing smirk played at his lips. You seemed awfully comfortable, is all I'm saying. Her face burned. And considering how quickly you ran off, I didn't even get the chance to properly introduce myself. He extended a hand. Alexander Reed. She stared at his outstretched hand like it was a trap. I know who you are. Ah, so now you recognize me? I recognized you yesterday, after I made a complete fool of myself. His eyes gleamed with amusement. To be fair, I rather enjoyed it. Haley nearly choked on air. This man was infuriating. Right. Well, glad I could provide some entertainment. If you'll excuse me, I have... Haley! She tensed at the sound of her manager's voice. Mr. Peterson stormed over, his usual scowl replaced that with something Haley had never seen before. Eagerness. Mr. Reed. Peterson all but purred. What an honor to have you here. Is my employee taking good care of you? Haley's stomach twisted. Alexander barely spared Peterson a glance. So far, so good. Peterson's grin widened. Excellent. If there's anything you need, anything at all, just say the word. Haley clenched her fists. Just yesterday, Peterson had snapped at her for taking too long with a customer. Now, because of who she was serving, he was practically tripping over himself to please her. Disgust curled in her gut. Actually, Alexander said, his voice deceptively casual, I'd like Haley to be the one to take care of my table for the rest of my visit. Haley's eyes widened. Peterson's smile twitched. Of course. I'll make sure she gives you undivided attention. Great. Just great. As Peterson walked away, Alexander turned back to her, looking far too pleased with himself. So, he said, where were we? Haley inhaled sharply. She had two choices, stand here and let this arrogant billionaire get under her skin, or do her job and get this over with. Professionalism won. Barely. Would you like anything else, Mr. Reed? She asked, emphasizing his name. His smirk didn't waver. For now, just conversation. She exhaled slowly, willing herself to remain calm. I'm at work. Precisely why I requested you. She narrowed her eyes. You requested me to take your order, not entertain you. He lifted his cup. Are they not the same thing? She wanted to throw something at him. Instead, she turned sharply on her heel. You know where to find me when you're ready to order something else. She shot over her shoulder. She could feel his amused gaze following her as she walked away. The rest of the day passed in a blur of coffee orders, impatient travelers, and the constant weight of Alexander Reed's presence. Every time she glanced at table 12, he was there, watching her like she was some sort of fascinating puzzle he had yet to solve. And then there was Peterson. The manager had never been a fan of Haley. But today, he treated her like a completely different person. Haley, he crooned, make sure Mr. Reed's cup never runs dry. Haley, don't rush Mr. Reed. Haley, maybe try smiling more at Mr. Reed. She had never wanted to quit a job so badly in her life. By the time her shift ended, she was more than ready to disappear. But of course, fate wasn't done with her yet. She was pulling off her apron when she heard his voice. Leaving so soon? She turned, and there he was, standing way too close. I work here, she reminded him. My shift is over. He studied her for a moment, then, without warning, held out a sleek ivory-colored business card. Haley stared at it, then at him. What's this? A job offer. She blinked. What? Dinner. Tomorrow night. My penthouse. You cook. She definitely wasn't hearing that right. Wait. You're hiring me as a chef. I'm offering you a chance to earn more money in one night than you do in a week here. Her stomach twisted. And why exactly would you do that? His gaze didn't waver. Because I like your fire, Haley. She swallowed hard. He tilted his head. Unless, of course, you're afraid. Her eyes flashed. I'm not afraid. Then say yes. Everything in her screamed no. This was dangerous, reckless. And yet, her mind flickered to Ethan. The medical bills. The fear that never quite left her chest. Alexander Reed was a walking warning sign. But the money? That was real. Fine, she bit out. One night. A slow, victorious smile spread across his face. I'll send a car. As he walked away, Haley exhaled sharply. What had she just gotten herself into? Haley stood outside the towering glass skyscraper, clutching the strap of her bag like it was a lifeline. This was insane. A billionaire's penthouse? A private dinner she was supposed to cook? This was beyond anything she'd ever done before. The driver who had picked her up was still waiting in the sleek black town car behind her. But Haley forced herself to take a deep breath and step forward. As she approached the entrance, A uniformed doorman greeted her with the kind of polite indifference reserved for those who didn't belong in places like this. "Miss Bennett?" His voice was smooth, rehearsed. Haley nodded, adjusting her grip on the grocery bag she'd insisted on bringing herself. Yeah, you're expected." The man led her inside, past marble floors, so polished they reflected the soft golden light from the chandeliers above. The walls were sleek, decorated with modern art that probably cost more than her entire apartment complex. Her stomach tightened. What the hell was she doing here? A private elevator opened, and she stepped inside. The doors slid shut with a quiet hiss, enclosing her in a space that smelled like cedarwood and something distinctly expensive. Her reflection stared back at her in the mirror-paneled walls, eyes wide with uncertainty. Then, the elevator dinged, and the doors opened to a penthouse that belonged in a magazine. She barely had time to take it all in before a deep, smooth voice greeted her. "You're right on time." Haley turned to find Alexander Reed standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, casually dressed in dark slacks and a fitted black sweater. He looked infuriatingly at ease. Unlike her, she cleared her throat. "I brought groceries." His lips twitched. "Groceries?" "Yes," she then stepping inside. "You said I was cooking, and I didn't know what you had, so—" Alexander held up a hand. "You think I don't have a fully stocked kitchen?" Haley's mouth opened, then closed. "Okay. Maybe that was dumb." He smirked at her silence. "But I like that you came prepared." She huffed. "Good. Now, where's the kitchen?" He gestured toward a sleek, open-concept space that looked like it had never been used. Stainless steel appliances gleamed under recessed lighting, and the marble countertops were pristine. "Figures," Haley muttered. "It's like a showroom." Alexander leaned against the counter. "I don't cook much." "Shocker," she deadpanned. His smirk grew. "You're a terrible dinner guest, you know." Haley ignored him and started unpacking her ingredients. She was here for one reason: money. Not to trade banter with a billionaire. Except, at first he just observed. Then, he started asking questions. "You always wanted to be a waitress?" Haley paused mid-chop, glancing up. "I never wanted to be a waitress." Alexander raised a brow. "Then, what did you want?" She hesitated. "I don't know." "Come on," he pushed, arms crossing. "No childhood dreams?" She scoffed. "I didn't have the luxury of dreams." His expression shifted, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. "What would you have picked?" Haley exhaled, forcing herself to answer. "A chef, maybe." Alexander's lips curled. "And yet, here you are, cooking for me." She shot him a glare. "This is different." "Is it?" His voice was lower now, filled with something dangerous. She swallowed hard and turned back to the stove. She refused to let him get under her skin. An hour later, Haley set a plate down in front of Alexander, watching as he picked up his fork. He took a bite, then another. Finally, he leaned back, nodding. "Not bad." Haley rolled her eyes. "Wow, such high praise," he smirked. "I don't give compliments easily." "Yeah, I noticed." She took her own plate and sat across from him, trying to ignore the way he watched her. "So," he said after a moment, "why did you take this deal?" Haley hesitated. This was not a topic she wanted to discuss with him, but Alexander wasn't the type to let things go. "Money," she said shortly. "For what?" She tightened her grip on her fork. "Oh, to you, it's personal." Alexander studied her. "Ethan." Her head snapped up. His expression didn't change. "Your brother." A sharp defensive wall went up inside her. "How do you—" "I did my research." Her stomach twisted. "That's not as creepy as you think." Her jaw clenched. Why do you even care? For the first time since she met him, Alexander's smirk vanished. Because you're different. Haley blinked. Excuse me? I see people all the time, he said simply. They see my money, my power. They try to impress me, manipulate me, use me. His gaze locked onto hers. But you were different from the second you ran into me. Haley felt something strange coil in her stomach. She shook her head, trying to push away the weight of his words. I think you're reading too much into a mistake. Alexander chuckled, but it was low and knowing. I don't believe in mistakes. A silence stretched between them, charged and heavy. Then finally Alexander leaned back, smirk returning. Tomorrow. Same time. Haley blinked. What? I'm hiring you for the week, remember? She gaped. You expect me to come back? He shrugged. Unless you'd rather turn down the money. Her fists clenched. He knew she couldn't. She had no choice. Fine, she bit out. Alexander grinned. As she left that night, she could still feel his gaze on her. And something told her that this was only the beginning. The next evening, Haley found herself standing in front of Alexander Reed's penthouse door again. She wasn't sure why her heart was pounding. Maybe because this arrangement was anything but normal. Maybe because Alexander wasn't normal. He was a billionaire. She was a struggling waitress, and yet, here she was. Again. Taking a deep breath, she knocked. The door swung open almost immediately. And there he was, leaning against the frame, sleeves rolled up, looking effortlessly put together. You're late, Haley huffed. By 2 minutes, Alexander smirked. I'm a man who values time. She pushed past him, entering the penthouse. Well, I value my sanity. And yet, here I am. He chuckled, closing the door behind her. Kitchen's yours, he said, nodding toward the sleek, modern space. Haley rolled up her sleeves. Time to work. As she cooked, she noticed something different. Alexander wasn't working tonight. Instead, he leaned against the counter watching her. Silently. What? She finally snapped, stirring the sauce. You're interesting? She scoffed. I'm a woman making dinner, Alexander. Not a magician. He tilted his head. That's not what I meant. She gave him a skeptical look. Then, what did you mean? Alexander was quiet for a moment. Then, to her shock, he sat down at the kitchen island, his expression thoughtful. I don't usually do this. Haley raised a brow. What? Eat? He smirked. Number sit. Talk. Let people into my home. Haley hesitated, then turned off the stove. I find that hard to believe, she said. You're a billionaire. You must have a ton of people around you all the time. He exhaled. That's the problem. She frowned, walking toward him. You're saying you're lonely? Alexander chuckled, but it wasn't his usual arrogant sound. It was quieter. I have company, he admitted. But that doesn't mean I have connection. Haley stared at him, surprised. She never expected to hear something like that from a man like him. Before she could respond, he changed the subject. What about you? He asked. Your family? Haley's stomach twisted. She glanced down at the countertop, suddenly busy, wiping a non-existent stain. My brother, she said finally. Ethan. Alexander waited. Haley sighed. He's 12, smart, funny. A pain in my ass, but I love him. She paused. He's sick. Alexander's sharp gaze locked onto hers. Haley swallowed. Kidney disease? The words felt heavy, like admitting them made them more real. For a second she thought he'd say something cliché. I'm sorry. But he didn't. Instead, he nodded. That's why you work so hard. Haley looked up, startled. You don't have to explain, he said quietly. I get it. And for some reason, that meant more than she wanted to admit. The next day, Haley returned to the penthouse, expecting another quiet evening of cooking. Instead, she walked into chaos. There was a woman standing in the middle of the living room, her back straight, her manicured fingers curled around a crystal glass of wine. She was beautiful, tall, elegant, with blonde hair swept into a flawless bun. And she was angry. Alexander stood opposite her, his arms crossed, his expression cold. "Vanessa," he said, voice sharp, "I told you not to show up unannounced." Haley froze. Oh, hell no. She knew that name. Vanessa Sinclair, the ex-girlfriend, the famous ex-girlfriend. Vanessa turned, eyes narrowing, as she took in Haley. "And who is this?" she asked, voice laced with disdain. Haley opened her mouth, but Alexander spoke first. "She's none of your business." Vanessa's eyes flashed. "I highly doubt that." Then she stepped closer to Haley, her lips curving into a sharp smile. "Oh, sweetheart," she said mockingly. "I hope you don't think you're special." Haley's spine stiffened. "I don't need to think it," she shot back. "I know I am." Alexander smirked. Vanessa, however, was not amused. "You're playing a dangerous game," she murmured. Haley crossed her arms. "You think this is a game?" She leaned in slightly. "I don't play games, Vanessa." A tense silence settled between them. Then Alexander chuckled. "That's enough," he said, stepping between them. "Vanessa, leave." Vanessa's eyes burned with anger, but she turned on her heel, heading for the door. Before leaving, she shot Haley one last venomous look. Then she was gone. Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Well," Haley said dryly, "she seems fun." Alexander laughed, and for some reason that felt like a victory. After Vanessa left, the atmosphere felt different, charged. Haley went back to the kitchen, but she could feel Alexander watching her. Finally, she turned. "What?" He hesitated. Then quietly he said, "She doesn't matter." Haley's throat tightened. "I don't care," she lied. Alexander stepped closer. "Good," he murmured. They stared at each other, and for the first time, Haley realized something terrifying. She was falling for him. And that was a problem. The cold wind bit into Haley's skin as she rushed through the crowded streets of New York. She wasn't supposed to be running. Not when she had just finished her shift. Not when her legs ached from standing for 12 hours straight. And certainly not when she hadn't eaten a proper meal all day. But nothing else mattered. Not when she had just received a phone call that shattered her world. Ethan. He was in the hospital. Her fingers were trembling as she clutched her phone to her chest, her heartbeat echoing louder than the city traffic around her. She could still hear the doctor's words ringing in her head. "His condition has worsened. He needs a procedure. Immediately." Her stomach twisted. She knew what that meant. Money. And money was the one thing she didn't have. She pushed harder, sprinting down the sidewalk, her breath coming in short gasps. By the time she reached the hospital, her hands were shaking as she threw the door open and rushed inside. "Ethan Bennett," she gasped to the nurse at the front desk. "Where is he?" The woman glanced up, calm and composed, in a way that Haley envied. "Room 306, she said. "Dr. Howard is waiting for you." Haley didn't wait for anything else. She ran. Ethan looked small in the hospital bed. Too small. His face was pale, his usual bright eyes dimmer than they had been that morning. Haley swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing a smile. "Hey, bud," she whispered, walking to his side. Ethan turned his head slightly, giving her a weak grin. "Hey, Hales," he murmured. "Did I scare you?" Haley let out a shaky laugh, sitting beside him. "A little." He reached for her hand, his grip weaker than she remembered. "I'm okay," he said softly. But he wasn't. She knew that, and the doctor confirmed it moments later. The treatment he needs is urgent, Dr. Howard explained. We can stabilize him for now, but without the surgery, his condition will deteriorate. Haley felt like she couldn't breathe. How much? She asked, already dreading the answer. Dr. Howard hesitated before telling her. Haley felt her heart drop. It was more than she made in a year, maybe even 2. She gripped the edge of the hospital bed to steady herself. I don't have that kind of money, she whispered. Dr. Howard gave her a sympathetic look. We can discuss payment plans, but we need an initial deposit, soon. Haley nodded numbly. Then she turned to Ethan, forcing another smile. Don't worry about it, she told him, brushing a hand through his hair. I'll figure something out. Ethan studied her for a moment, before squeezing her hand. I know you will, he murmured. But Haley wasn't so sure. She barely registered leaving the hospital. Her mind was spinning, calculating every possible way she could get the money. A second job? No, she barely had time for her first one. A loan. She had no credit. She was out of options. That's when her phone buzzed. Alexander Reed. She hesitated, then answered. Haley? His voice was smooth, calm. Where are you? She blinked. Why? You're upset, he said simply. I can tell. Haley let out a hollow laugh. Wow. The billionaire can read emotions. Incredible. She expected him to be annoyed. Instead, he said, Where are you? She hesitated, then sighed. Lower Manhattan. Meet me at the penthouse, he said. Now. I can't. Haley. His voice was softer this time. Let me help. She nearly dropped her phone. Her heart clenched. She didn't want his help. She hated the idea of being a charity case. But she had no other choice. The elevator ride up to Alexander's penthouse felt like a countdown. By the time the doors opened, she was ready for a fight. Alexander was waiting for her, standing near the massive window overlooking the city. He turned as she walked in, his gaze sharp. You look terrible, he said. Haley let out a dry laugh. Gee, thanks. He motioned to the couch. Sit. She crossed her arms. I'd rather stand. Alexander sighed. Then tell me why you're here. She clenched her jaw. I need money, she admitted. He didn't react. How much? She told him. Still no reaction. Then, after a moment, he said, I'll give it to you. Haley blinked, just like that. No, she said immediately. Alexander raised a brow. No? I'm not taking handouts. He studied her for a moment. Then slowly a smirk curved his lips. Fine, he said. Then let's make a deal. She frowned. A deal? He stepped closer. Work for me, he said. For 1 week. Haley stared. As what? My personal chef, he said. 3 meals a day for 7 days. She narrowed her eyes. You want me to cook for you? Alexander shrugged. You need money. I need good food. It sounded ridiculous. It was ridiculous. But what choice did she have? Her pride screamed at her to walk away, but Ethan's face flashed in her mind. His pale skin, his tired eyes. She took a deep breath, then slowly she extended her hand. Deal. Alexander took it, his grip firm. Good, he said, his voice unreadable. Then you start tomorrow. Haley stood in front of the gleaming glass doors of Reed Tower, staring at the reflection of a woman who looked entirely out of place. She adjusted the strap of her worn-out messenger bag, swallowed hard, and took a deep breath. It's just a week, she reminded herself. 1 week of cooking for Alexander Reed in exchange for enough money to save Ethan's life. It should have been a simple transaction. Yet, nothing about Alexander Reed was simple. She pushed open the doors, and the sheer opulence of the lobby hit her like a wave. Marble floors, gold-trimmed walls, and a chandelier that probably cost more than her entire yearly salary. The receptionist barely spared her a glance before pressing a button. "The penthouse is expecting you, Miss Bennett." Haley hesitated. "The penthouse is expecting me." She had barely agreed to this deal 12 hours ago, yet it felt like Alexander had everything planned before she even said yes. The elevator ride was unnervingly smooth. No music, no slight shake, just a seamless ascent to a world far above hers. When the doors slid open, her breath caught. The penthouse was massive. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the New York skyline, bathing the space in golden morning light. Minimalist, modern, and luxurious. And standing in the middle of it all, Alexander Reed. He was dressed casually for once. Dark slacks, an expensive-looking sweater with the sleeves pushed up, revealing strong forearms. His sharp, calculating eyes landed on her instantly. "You're late," he said smoothly. Haley scowled. "I said I'd be here at 9. It's 9:05. His lips twitched. "Like I said, late." She rolled her eyes. "You really don't have anything better to do than time me." Alexander ignored her and gestured toward the massive open kitchen. "Your domain for the week," he said. Haley stepped inside, and, good God, this wasn't just a kitchen. This was a chef's dream. A 6-burner stove, a double oven, a built-in fridge larger than her entire apartment kitchen. Pristine white countertops stretched out in a perfect L shape, and the cabinets were fully stocked with ingredients most people could only dream of using. At first, he just observed. Then, he started asking questions. "You always wanted to be a waitress?" Haley paused mid-chop, glancing up. "I never wanted to be a waitress." Alexander raised a brow. "Then, what did you want?" She hesitated. "I don't know." "Come on," he pushed, arms crossing. "No childhood dreams?" She scoffed. "I didn't have the luxury of dreams." His expression shifted, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. "What would you have picked?" Haley exhaled, forcing herself to answer. "A chef, maybe." Alexander's lips curled. "And yet, here you are, cooking for me." She shot him a glare. "This is different." "Is it?" His voice was lower now, filled with something dangerous. She swallowed hard and turned back to the stove. She refused to let him get under her skin. An hour later, Haley set a plate down in front of Alexander, watching as he picked up his fork. He took a bite, then another. Finally, he leaned back, nodding. "Not bad." Haley rolled her eyes. "Wow, such high praise," he smirked. "I don't give compliments easily." "Yeah, I noticed." She took her own plate and sat across from him, trying to ignore the way he watched her. "So," he said after a moment, "why did you take this deal?" Haley hesitated. This was not a topic she wanted to discuss with him, but Alexander wasn't the type to let things go. "Money," she said shortly. "For what?" She tightened her grip on her fork. "Oh, to you, it's personal." Alexander studied her. "Ethan." Her head snapped up. His expression didn't change. "Your brother." A sharp defensive wall went up inside her. "How do you—" "I did my research." Her stomach twisted. "That's not as creepy as you think." Her jaw clenched. "Why do you even care?" For the first time since she met him, Alexander's smirk vanished. "Because you're different." Haley blinked. "Excuse me?" "I see people all the time," he said simply. "They see my money, my power. They try to impress me, manipulate me, use me." His gaze locked onto hers. "But you were different from the second you ran into me." Haley felt something strange coil in her stomach. She shook her head, trying to push away the weight of his words. "I think you're reading too much into a mistake." Alexander chuckled, but it was low and knowing. "I don't believe in mistakes." A silence stretched between them, charged and heavy. Then finally Alexander leaned back, smirk returning. Tomorrow. Same time. Haley blinked. What? I'm hiring you for the week, remember? She gaped. You expect me to come back? He shrugged. Unless you'd rather turn down the money. Her fists clenched. He knew she couldn't. She had no choice. Fine, she bit out. Alexander grinned. As she left that night, she could still feel his gaze on her. And something told her that this was only the beginning. Haley exhaled slowly. Okay, maybe this won't be so bad. She turned back to Alexander, crossing her arms. So, what do you want for breakfast, Your Highness? He smirked. Surprise me? Haley wasn't intimidated by expensive kitchens, but Alexander Reed, that was a different story. He didn't leave, didn't go to his office, didn't even pretend to be busy. Instead, he watched her, leaning against the counter, arms crossed, sharp gray eyes tracking her every movement. You're hovering, she muttered, cracking eggs into a bowl. I'm observing, he corrected. Same thing. He smirked but didn't argue. Haley ignored him, focusing on the food. 15 minutes later, she placed a plate of fluffy scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, and golden brown toast in front of him. Alexander picked up his fork, took a slow bite, and paused. His expression didn't change, but she caught the way his shoulders relaxed slightly. Good? She asked. Alexander set down his fork and met her gaze. It's acceptable. Haley snorted. High praise coming from Mr. Billionaire. He smirked. Let's see if you can keep it up. By the second day, Haley had learned 3 things. Alexander Reed did not eat junk food. He worked constantly, but never seemed stressed. He had a frustrating habit of making her feel flustered, without even trying. She tried to stick to the deal. Cook, serve, leave. But Alexander wasn't making it easy. Why are you still here? She demanded one afternoon, when she found him sitting at the kitchen counter, reading emails. This is my home, he said dryly. Then go. Do billionaire things. He smirked. Define billionaire things. I don't know. She threw up her hands. Buy a yacht, yell at your assistants, swim in a pool of gold coins. Alexander chuckled, setting his phone down. You have a very warped view of wealth. Haley scowled. No, I have a realistic view of billionaires. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his gaze pinning her in place. And what kind of billionaire do you think I am, Haley? She swallowed. The worst kind, she said. The kind that doesn't care about people unless they benefit you. For the first time, something in Alexander's expression shifted, something unreadable. Then he simply said, You might be right, and left the room. The third day, a visitor arrived. Haley was chopping vegetables when the front door opened. A woman's voice, smooth, sharp, familiar, rang out. Alex, darling, are you avoiding me? Haley froze. Then slowly she turned, to find Vanessa Sinclair standing in the living room. Tall, elegant, a designer bag hanging off one arm, her blonde hair cascading in perfect waves, and her eyes locked directly on Haley. Haley clenched the knife in her hand. Vanessa's lips curled into a smirk. Oh, you must be the new entertainment. Alexander walked in before Haley could snap back. Vanessa, he said, his tone unreadable. Vanessa turned to him, smiling. Alex, you look good. I'd say the same, but that would be a lie. Vanessa's smile didn't falter. Charming as always. Her gaze flickered back to Haley. And this is... Haley opened her mouth, but Alexander beat her to it. Haley is my chef. Vanessa blinked, then laughed. Oh, Alex, she purred. Hiring staff for entertainment now. Haley bristled. I'm right here, you know. Vanessa's eyes glittered. I can see that. Alexander sighed. What do you want, Vanessa? She stepped closer, her smile sharp. You know what I want. Her fingers trailed down his arm. Haley's stomach twisted. Alexander removed Vanessa's hand. That's not happening. Vanessa's lips twitched. Are you sure? Positive? For the first time, Haley saw something crack in Vanessa's expression, but it was gone in an instant. She straightened, smoothing down her dress. Well, she said lightly, it was worth a try. Then she turned to Haley. Good luck, sweetheart, and walked out. Alexander sighed, clearly unamused. Cooking, she snorted. That's not what I'd call it. He shot her a look. I don't see you helping. Haley smirked, stepping forward. I didn't know billionaires needed help. Alexander set the pan down and leaned against the counter. I don't, he said, but I wouldn't mind it. That was unexpected. For the first time, he didn't sound like the arrogant, untouchable businessman. He sounded human. Haley hesitated, then with a sigh, she took the spatula from his hand. Move, she said. Let me show you how it's done. Alexander smirked. Bossy, efficient, she corrected. And just like that, the balance shifted. That evening, as Haley was preparing dinner, Alexander walked in and leaned against the counter. You're not working late, she asked. He shrugged. I had something more important to do. She raised a brow. And that is? He slid a small black envelope onto the counter. Haley eyed it suspiciously before picking it up. A dinner invitation? She read aloud. Alexander nodded. Charity gala. Tomorrow night. She frowned. And you're telling me this because I want you to come with me. Haley's brain short-circuited. What? You heard me. She blinked. You want me to go to a fancy billionaire event? Yes. She laughed, shaking her head. Are you insane? Debatable, he said smoothly. But the offer stands. Haley opened her mouth, closed it. This was insane. Absolutely insane. And yet, she found herself considering it. The next evening, Haley stood in front of the full-length mirror in one of New York's most exclusive boutiques. She barely recognized herself. The dress Alexander had chosen for her was sleek, elegant, and far too expensive. You clean up well, a voice drawled. Haley turned and nearly dropped dead. Alexander stood in the doorway, wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo. She gaped. What? He asked. You. She gestured at him. You look like an actual prince. Alexander smirked. And you look like trouble. Haley swallowed. Oh, that was not a normal compliment. Before she could process it, Alexander offered his arm. Ready? Number. Not even close. But she took his arm anyway, because something told her. This night was about to change everything. The black town car pulled up in front of the Astoria Grand, one of New York's most elite event venues. From the moment Haley stepped out, she felt every pair of eyes snap toward her. The flashing lights from paparazzi cameras blinded her for a second, the murmurs from the crowd buzzing in her ears. She swallowed hard. What am I doing here? The thought repeated in her mind as Alexander stepped beside her, exuding confidence in his tailored tuxedo. Stay close, he murmured, offering his arm. She hesitated for only a second before linking her arm with his, and just like that, they stepped into his world. The ballroom was breathtaking. Golden chandeliers cast a warm glow over the marble floors, the air thick with the scent of champagne and money. Everywhere Haley looked, there were men in expensive suits and women in gowns that probably cost more than her yearly salary. She felt painfully out of place. Alexander, on the other hand, looked entirely at home. He greeted other guests with effortless charm, shaking hands and nodding politely. But Haley wasn't fooled. His posture was calculated. His smiles never reached his eyes. This wasn't his world. It was his prison. "You're staring," Alexander murmured, barely glancing at her. Haley flushed. I don't mind," he added, smirking. She rolled her eyes. "How do you deal with all this?" He took a sip of champagne. "You learn to wear the mask." Something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. She was about to respond when, "Oh my God, Alexander, I was wondering when you'd show up." Haley turned and, of course, Vanessa Sinclair. Vanessa looked immaculate, draped in a shimmering emerald dress that hugged her curves perfectly. Her sharp gaze landed on Haley. "And you brought her," she said smoothly, eyes scanning Haley's dress like a jeweler inspecting fake diamonds. Haley clenched her jaw. Alexander, to his credit, didn't even flinch. "Vanessa," he greeted coolly. She smiled, placing a hand on his chest. "You look amazing. I was hoping we could catch up." Alexander smoothly stepped back, letting her hand fall. "I doubt we have anything to discuss." Haley smirked. "Damn, that was smooth." Vanessa's lips twitched. Then she turned to Haley. "You must be having quite the Cinderella moment," she said sweetly. "Tell me, do you plan to leave before midnight? Or are you hoping the shoe fits?" Haley smiled innocently. "Oh, I don't think I need to run. Unlike you, I wasn't replaced." Alexander chuckled under his breath. Vanessa's smile froze for half a second before she recovered. "Charming," she said. Then to Alexander, "We'll talk later." And with that, she strutted away. Haley exhaled. Alexander looked down at her, amusement flickering in his gray eyes. "That was impressive," he admitted. She smirked. "You're not the only one who can handle difficult people, Mr. Reed." For the first time that night, his smirk softened into something else. Something unreadable. "Noted," he murmured. And just like that, something shifted between them. As the evening continued, Haley found herself loosening up. The people, the luxury. It was overwhelming, but not impossible, especially with Alexander beside her. Then came the moment she wasn't expecting. The band started playing a slow, elegant waltz, and suddenly Alexander was holding out his hand. "May I?" Haley blinked. "You want to dance? With me?" "That is the general idea." She hesitated. I'll lead." Before she could protest, his hand was on her waist, his fingers lacing with hers. And just like that, they were moving. Haley barely had time to think. Alexander was effortless. Every step, every turn. It was like he had memorized the dance before she even learned the first step. She looked up at him, breath catching slightly. "You do this often?" she murmured. His gaze met hers. "Not since I was forced to as a child." Haley bit her lip to hide a smile. "Well, at least you're good at it," he smirked. "Are you complimenting me?" She rolled her eyes. "Don't get used to it." For the first time that night, Alexander laughed. A real, genuine laugh. And something in Haley's chest tightened. Because for all his walls and arrogance, she liked this version of him. And that was dangerous. As the night wore on, Haley found herself drifting away from the crowd, standing by the balcony overlooking the city. The cold air nipped at her skin. A moment later, Alexander appeared beside her, slipping his jacket over her shoulders. She tensed. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." Silence stretched between them. Then, "This isn't your world," he murmured. "Is it?" She exhaled. "No. You don't want to be here." She hesitated. "I don't belong here." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You belong wherever you want to be." Haley turned to face him, searching his expression. For once there was no mask, no arrogance, just him. And suddenly the space between them felt impossibly small. Haley's breath caught. Alexander's gaze flickered to her lips. And just like that, the world stilled. She didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was her. But in the next heartbeat, his lips were on hers. The kiss was slow, deep, like a promise neither of them were ready to make, and yet neither of them pulled away. Until a voice interrupted. "Mr. Reed, your car is ready." The moment shattered. Alexander exhaled, stepping back. Haley swallowed hard. What the hell just happened? She searched his face, trying to read his thoughts, but his mask was back. And that hurt more than she expected. The air inside the limousine was thick with silence. Haley sat beside Alexander, but the space between them felt wider than ever. She could still feel the ghost of his lips against hers, the heat of his hands on her waist. But now, his walls were back up. He hadn't spoken a word since they left the gala. Had it been a mistake? Had she made a mistake? Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. "Are we going to talk about it?" she asked, voice steady despite the storm inside her. Alexander didn't look at her. "Talk about what?" Haley let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe the fact that you kissed me and now you're acting like it never happened?" His jaw tightened. It shouldn't have happened. Haley felt something inside her crack. She forced a smirk. Wow. Way to make a girl feel special. Alexander turned to her then, eyes dark. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" she pressed. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "It complicates things," he muttered. Haley crossed her arms. "So?" Alexander sighed. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand," she snapped. For the first time, Alexander looked frustrated, not at her, at himself. And that scared her more than anything. Because maybe, just maybe, he didn't hate that kiss as much as he wanted to. The car pulled up to his penthouse. But before Haley could step out, Alexander caught her wrist. "Haley." His voice was quieter now, almost hesitant. She swallowed. "What?" He searched her face, then, "I need you to trust me." Haley frowned. "Why do I feel like you're about to ask me not to trust you?" He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. Then, he let go. And Haley felt the loss more than she expected. She followed him inside, her mind spinning. Trust him? How could she trust someone who wouldn't even trust himself? But the real bombshell hadn't even dropped yet. Because the next morning, she was about to learn something that would change everything. It started with a phone call. Haley was in the kitchen, making breakfast, when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello," a male voice responded. "Haley Bennett?" She tensed. "Who's asking?" There was a pause. Then, "I think you should know the truth about Alexander Reed." Her stomach dropped. "Excuse me?" The voice continued, eerily calm. "Did you know his company was responsible for shutting down your family's restaurant?" The blood drained from her face. The phone nearly slipped from her grip. "What?" The man on the other end sighed. "Ask him yourself," he said. "But don't expect him to tell you the truth." Then, the line went dead. Haley stood there, heart pounding. This had to be a mistake. Alexander couldn't have, could he? She spun around. And there he was, standing in the doorway watching her, like he knew. And suddenly, Haley had never been so sure of something in her life. He did know, and he had kept it from her. The room felt too small. Haley's pulse thundered in her ears as she faced him. "Tell me it's not true," she said, voice shaking. Alexander was silent. That was her answer. Her chest tightened. You knew, didn't you? Still nothing. Haley let out a sharp laugh, one that had zero humor. I can't believe this, she muttered. Alexander took a step closer. Haley, don't, she snapped. She shook her head, stepping back. You let me stay here. You let me think. She let out a breath. Did you ever plan on telling me? Alexander's jaw tightened. I didn't know. Until recently. Haley scoffed. Oh, that makes it better. Haley, listen to me. No. She cut him off, fists clenched at her sides. You destroyed my family's dream, Alexander, she shouted. And now what? You just… What? Feel bad about it. Think throwing money at me is gonna fix everything. Alexander's expression darkened. That's not. Then what is it? He exhaled, looking away. Haley's throat burned. Because the worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was the fact that, despite everything, she still wanted to trust him. And that made her hate herself. Haley turned, heading toward the door. She needed to get out of here. But before she could, Alexander grabbed her wrist. Don't go, he said, voice low. Her breath caught. She looked up at him. And for the first time, she saw something that scared her more than the betrayal. Regret. It was there, raw in his storm-gray eyes. She hesitated, just for a second. Then she pulled her hand away, and she walked out the door, leaving everything behind, including him. Haley walked through the freezing streets of Manhattan, but she barely felt the cold. Her mind was still spinning. Alexander knew. He knew that his company had been responsible for shutting down her family's restaurant, the only thing her parents had left behind, and he had kept it from her. Her stomach twisted. How could she have been so stupid? How could she have let herself fall for him? The worst part was, even now, after everything, a small part of her wanted to believe there was an explanation. But what possible excuse could he have? She had given him her trust, and he had shattered it. Haley didn't realize where she was walking until she stopped in front of an all-too-familiar door. Her tiny, run-down apartment. She swallowed hard. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had lived here, back when her world had been small, when she had only worried about making enough money to pay for Ethan's treatments, back before Alexander Reed had turned her life upside down. She took a deep breath and walked inside. The place smelled the same, a mix of old wood and laundry detergent. And then, Haley? Her heart squeezed at the small, sleepy voice. Ethan stood in the hallway, rubbing his eyes. Her little brother. The only person in the world who had ever truly depended on her. Seeing him made the pain in her chest even worse. Because she had failed him. Again. Ethan blinked up at her. You're back as early, he said, stifling a yawn. Haley forced a smile. Yeah. Something came up. But her voice cracked at the end. Ethan frowned. You're upset. She opened her mouth to lie. But the truth was too heavy. So instead, she knelt down and pulled him into a hug. His small arms wrapped around her, and for the first time all night, she felt grounded, safe. For a moment, she just let herself breathe. Then, Ethan coughed. And something in that cough wasn't right. Haley froze. Ethan. She pulled back, studying his face. His cheeks were too pale. His lips had a slight bluish tint. Fear spiked through her. Are you okay? Ethan gave her a weak smile. I'm fine. Just tired. But Haley knew better. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She didn't waste another second. Haley grabbed her coat, then lifted Ethan into her arms. He was lighter than she remembered. Too light. Her chest tightened. She rushed outside, barely noticing the freezing wind. Getting a cab took forever, but eventually she managed to hail one. Mount Sinai Hospital. she told the driver, her voice shaking. Hurry, please. Ethan let out a weak chuckle. You're freaking out again. Haley shot him a look. You don't get to make jokes when you look like that. Ethan sighed but didn't argue. He just leaned his head against her shoulder, and Haley held him tighter, as if that could somehow keep him safe. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee. Haley barely noticed as she rushed through the doors. Help! She called out. My brother, he's not. Doctors and nurses swarmed. Ethan was whisked away. Haley tried to follow, but a nurse gently stopped her. Ma'am, you need to wait here. Wait while her brother was in danger? Haley clenched her fists, panic rising. She hated this, feeling helpless, useless. Her legs felt weak. She sank into a chair. And then, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor walked in. His face was serious, and Haley's stomach dropped. Miss Bennett? She shot up from her chair. Is he okay? The doctor sighed. He's stabilized, but his kidneys are failing faster than we expected. Haley's heart stopped. He needs a transplant, the doctor continued. Soon. Everything around her blurred. But, she choked, that could take months, years. The doctor gave her a look. You should start looking for a donor immediately. Haley felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She should have left it alone. She should have. But as she sat there staring at her hands, she knew there was only one person who could help her. Her fingers shook as she pulled out her phone. She stared at his name on the screen. Alexander Reed. Then, before she could change her mind, she pressed call. The phone rang once, twice. Then, Haley? His voice was hoarse, as if he'd been waiting for her call. Her throat tightened. She wanted to scream at him, tell him he had no right to sound so relieved. But there was no time for anger, no time for pride. So instead, she whispered the one thing she never thought she'd say. I need you. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, I'm on my way. And just like that, everything changed. Haley sat in the dimly lit hospital waiting room, her hands clenched together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her entire world had been reduced to this moment. Ethan was in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. And she was stuck here, waiting. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. She wanted to scream, to run into that room and demand that the doctors do something, anything to save her little brother. But all she could do was sit here feeling helpless. Then, a pair of expensive leather shoes stopped in front of her. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Alexander. His presence was a storm, one that she wasn't sure she could handle right now. But she had called him. She had asked him for help. And now, he was here. Alexander didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her. And for once, Haley didn't see the arrogant billionaire. She saw a man who looked concerned, guilty, like he would do anything to fix this. Where is he? Alexander asked, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. Haley swallowed hard. ICU. Alexander nodded, his jaw tight. I spoke with the doctors, he said. They'll move him to a private suite, and I've already arranged for the best specialists. Haley's stomach twisted. I didn't ask you to do that. You didn't have to. There was no arrogance in his voice, no expectation, just certainty, like he would have done it anyway. Haley felt something in her chest tighten, because as much as she wanted to fight him, to tell him that she didn't need his money, his help, his guilt, she knew that Ethan needed this, and she wouldn't let her pride cost her brother his life. So she just nodded. Thank you. The hours stretched on. Doctors came in and out, updating her on Ethan's condition. The verdict was clear. He needed a kidney transplant, soon. Haley felt the panic rising again. Finding a donor could take months, years. They didn't have that kind of time. Alexander must have noticed the way her breathing quickened because he knelt down in front of her, resting a hand on her knee. Haley. She flinched at the softness in his voice. We'll find one. She wanted to believe him, but she had spent her entire life watching the system fail people like her. So she just shook her head. You don't know that. Alexander exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Then let me help. How? She snapped. You can't just buy a kidney, Alexander. That's not how this works. But instead of arguing, he pulled out his phone. And before she could stop him, he called his private medical team. Haley sat in shock as Alexander spoke. His voice was calm, commanding, like a man who was used to getting what he wanted. And what he wanted was to save Ethan. Within minutes, he had arranged for Ethan to be placed on a priority donor list. Haley's breath caught. How did you say? Now Alexander slipped his phone back into his pocket. I have resources. Of course, he did. She should have been angry that he was using his wealth to cut through the system. But right now she didn't care, because this meant Ethan had a chance, and that was all that mattered. Hours passed. Haley stayed by Ethan's bedside, refusing to leave. She held his hand, whispering promises that she wasn't sure she could keep. Then, Ethan stirred. His eyelids fluttered, and then, Haley? Her heart nearly stopped. Ethan. His voice was barely above a whisper. Am I dying? Haley's breath hitched. No, she said fiercely. You're not. Ethan gave her a weak smile. Liar. Tears burned her eyes. You have to fight, okay? She whispered. You have to. His fingers tightened slightly around hers. I'm tired, Haley. She bit her lip, trying to hold it together. I know, buddy. I know. But you don't get to give up. Not yet. Ethan exhaled softly. Then, Alexander? Haley turned, surprised to see that Ethan was looking at him. Alexander hesitated, then stepped closer. Yeah, kid. Ethan studied him for a long moment. You're really helping my sister? Alexander nodded. I am. Ethan gave him a look. Because you like her. Haley's face burned. Ethan. But the kid just smirked weakly. Just making sure your intentions are good, he muttered, before his eyes drifted closed again. Haley's heart twisted. Ethan was still fighting. But they were running out of time. At 3:17 a.m., the hospital doors burst open. A doctor rushed inside. We found a match. Haley felt her entire body go numb. What? The doctor nodded, looking between her and Alexander. A donor just came through. We're prepping Ethan for surgery now. Haley didn't even realize she was crying until Alexander reached over and wiped a tear from her cheek. It's going to be okay, he murmured. And for the first time in a long time, she actually believed him. The next hours were the longest of Haley's life. Ethan was in surgery. Alexander never left her side. She should have told him to go, that she didn't need him here, but she did. So when the doctor finally walked out, pulling off his mask, Haley nearly collapsed from the weight of it all. It was a success. Relief flooded through her. She let out a choked sob, covering her face with her hands. Then suddenly, arms wrapped around her, warm, strong. Alexander. And for the first time, she let herself sink into him. Because for once, she wasn't alone. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the most beautiful sound Haley had ever heard. It meant Ethan was alive. The surgery had been successful. Her little brother had survived. But even as relief washed over her, Haley couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something inside her. And the reason for that change was standing right outside Ethan's hospital room. Alexander Reed. Haley stepped into the hallway and found him leaning against the wall. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, and there was an exhaustion in his eyes that she had never seen before. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, he's going to be okay, she whispered. Alexander exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Good. It was just one word, but it was heavy, like it carried all the emotions he wasn't letting himself show. Haley's fingers curled into fists. She had spent the past few days hating him, hating that he had found a way to help her when she had spent years proving that she didn't need anyone. But when she looked at him now, she didn't feel hate. She felt something worse, something she didn't want to feel. Alexander. She hesitated. How could she even begin to say what was on her mind? But before she could find the words, he beat her to it. You don't owe me anything, Haley. Her breath hitched. What? His gaze locked onto hers. You think I did this because I expect something in return? A lump formed in her throat. Didn't he? That's how his world worked. Money, deals, control. But now, his expression was different. That's not what this was about, he continued. I helped because I wanted to, because it was the right thing to do. She wanted to believe him, but believing in him meant letting down her walls. And she couldn't do that. Not with him. Not when she knew what kind of man he was. So instead, she steeled herself. You should go, she said, her voice cold. Alexander blinked, caught off guard. Haley, thank you for everything, she cut in. But we don't owe each other anything. So, just go back to your world, and I'll stay in mine. The silence stretched between them. She could feel him watching her, like he was waiting for her to take it back. But she didn't. She couldn't. Finally, Alexander exhaled. His jaw tightened. Fine, he said, if that's what you want. And then he walked away, and Haley told herself that it didn't hurt, that she didn't care, that this was for the best. But she was lying, and she knew it. The next few days passed in a blur. Ethan was recovering well, and soon he would be discharged. That should have been all that mattered. But Haley couldn't shake the emptiness that lingered in her chest. It was his absence. Alexander was gone. No texts, no phone calls, no sudden appearances at the cafe. And she should have been relieved. Instead, she felt like she was missing a piece of herself, and that scared her more than anything. It was late one evening when the past came knocking, literally. A sharp knock on the cafe's back door made Haley freeze. It was after hours. The only people who came here this late were... She turned the lock and pulled the door open. And immediately, her stomach dropped. Vanessa Sinclair stood there, dressed in an expensive coat, her red lipstick as sharp as her smirk. Haley's grip on the door tightened. What do you want? Vanessa's smile widened. To talk. Haley laughed. You? Talk to me. That's rich. Vanessa tilted her head. Not as rich as Alexander. But you already know that, don't you? Haley's blood boiled. She started to shut the door, but Vanessa stopped it with her hand. Wait, she said. There was something in her voice, something that made Haley hesitate. Then, Vanessa's expression shifted. And suddenly, she didn't look like the confident, elegant socialite. She looked desperate. Listen to me, Vanessa said, her voice urgent. You need to stay away from him. Haley's breath caught. What? Vanessa swallowed hard. I thought I had him all figured out, she murmured. I thought I knew exactly how to play the game. But Alexander, he's not like other men. Haley frowned. Vanessa sighed, rubbing her temples. You think he's some cold, calculating billionaire, don't you? Haley stayed silent. Vanessa let out a humorless laugh. That's the mask he wears, she said. But underneath, he's the most dangerous kind of man. Haley's pulse spiked. What do you mean? Vanessa met her eyes. He's the kind of man who will make you believe you're different, she whispered. That you matter to him. That he's willing to change. Haley's heart pounded. And then? Vanessa's gaze darkened. And then he'll ruin you. The words sent a shiver down Haley's spine. For a moment she didn't know what to say. But then she found her voice. You don't know me, she said quietly. Vanessa's lips curled. No, she said, but I know him. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Haley standing there, more confused than ever. That night, Haley lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Vanessa's words echoed in her mind. He'll ruin you. But the worst part? It wasn't the warning that haunted her. It was the fact that, deep down, she wanted to be ruined by him. And that was terrifying. The days blurred into weeks. Haley tried to convince herself that she was fine, that Alexander's absence didn't leave a gaping hole in her life, that Vanessa's warning didn't replay in her mind every single night. But the truth? She was lying to herself, and she was exhausted. Between taking care of Ethan and managing the cafe, she barely had time to breathe, let alone process everything that had happened. But then, one night, everything changed. It was late. The cafe was closed. The lights dimmed. Haley sat alone at a corner table, staring at the financial report for the restaurant. The numbers were bleak. Even with the money Alexander had given her, reopening the restaurant was a daunting challenge. She would have to fight for it. She would have to make it on her own. And that was fine. That was what she wanted. She took a deep breath, rubbing her temples, when suddenly the bell over the door jingled. Haley's heart leaped. The cafe was supposed to be locked. She looked up, ready to tell off whoever had walked in. But when she saw who it was, her breath caught in her throat. Alexander Reed stood in the doorway, and for the first time in weeks, their eyes met. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It felt like time had stopped. Alexander was the first to break the silence. You're still working late, he said. His voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, something unspoken. Haley's fingers curled around the edge of the table. You shouldn't be here. Alexander stepped forward. Why not? She glared at him. Because you disappeared. His jaw tensed. You told me to. The words hung in the air, a reminder of the last time they had seen each other, of the way she had pushed him away, and the way he had let her. Haley's throat tightened. You didn't even fight me on it. Alexander's expression darkened. What was I supposed to do, Haley? Force you to let me stay? She opened her mouth to argue, but stopped, because the truth was, she had expected him to fight. She had wanted him to. But he hadn't, and that had hurt more than anything. Alexander exhaled. I left because I thought that's what you needed. His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. But I never stopped thinking about you. Haley's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to believe him. But then she remembered Vanessa's warning. She hated the fact that it still lingered in her mind. She hated that it made her doubt him. You say that now, she said. But people like you always get bored eventually. Alexander's eyes flashed. You think that's what this is? His voice was sharp now. A game? Haley crossed her arms. Isn't it? Alexander stepped closer. Do I look like I'm playing? His presence was overwhelming, and Haley hated that she still felt drawn to him. You're used to getting what you want, she whispered. And I'm just another challenge for you, aren't I? Alexander's gaze hardened. You really believe that? Give me one reason not to. His jaw clenched. Then, without warning, he pulled something from his coat pocket, a folder, and he dropped it onto the table in front of her. Read it, he said. Haley stared at it. She hesitated, but eventually she reached for the folder, and when she opened it, her stomach dropped. Inside the folder were documents, contracts, bank records, and a deed. Her restaurant's deed. Haley's pulse spiked. You bought the restaurant back, she whispered. Alexander's expression didn't change. I did. Her hands trembled. But why? Alexander's gaze bored into hers. Because it was yours, he said simply. And because I owed you the truth. Haley's heart pounded. Truth about what? Alexander hesitated. Then, the night I found out my company was responsible for shutting it down. His voice was quiet. I made them fix it. Her breath caught. What? Alexander stepped closer. I made them undo what they did to you. And not just that. I made sure that you'd never have to fight for it again. Haley shook her head. But why? Why would you? Because I care about you, Haley. The words hit her like a train. Silence fell between them. And in that moment, Haley realized something. This man, this cold, calculating billionaire, had just risked everything for her. And for the first time, she didn't know how to handle it. Haley exhaled, setting the documents down. Her hands were shaking. Alexander watched her carefully. So, what now? He asked. She swallowed. I don't know. Her heart was pounding. She could feel the weight of everything between them. The trust he had given her. The fear still clinging to her heart. But deep down, she knew she had two choices. She could run, again, or she could stay. And for the first time, Haley didn't want to run, but she also wasn't ready to fall. Not yet. She looked up at Alexander. Give me time, she whispered. He held her gaze, and then he nodded. As long as you need. Her breath hitched, because for the first time, she knew she had two choices. She could run, again, or she could stay. And for the first time, Haley didn't want to run, but she also wasn't ready to fall. Not yet. She looked up at Alexander. Give me time, she whispered. He held her gaze, and then he nodded. As long as you need. Her breath hitched, because for the first time, she knew that when she was ready, he would still be there, waiting for her. And that scared her more than anything. But it also made her feel something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Haley couldn't sleep. She sat by the window in her apartment, staring at the city lights, replaying every moment from earlier that night. The way Alexander had looked at her. The way his voice had softened when he told her he cared. The truth he had finally shared with her. And now she had the deed to her family's restaurant in her hands. The one thing she had spent years mourning. She should feel relieved. She should feel happy. But instead, she felt terrified. Because this wasn't just about the restaurant anymore. It was about him. And about her. And about the fact that she wasn't sure if she was ready to admit the truth. That she had already fallen for Alexander Reed. A sudden vibration snapped her out of her thoughts. Her phone was ringing. She grabbed it, glancing at the screen. Unknown number. Her stomach dropped. She almost didn't answer, but something in her gut told her that she had to. Taking a deep breath, she swiped the screen. Hello? A pause. Then, a voice she hadn't heard in years. Haley Bennett. Her blood ran cold. It was her father's lawyer, and the words that came next would change everything. I think we need to talk. Haley sat frozen on the couch. The lawyer's voice was calm. Too calm. As you know, your father left behind some unfinished business before he passed. Her fingers tightened around the phone. What kind of business? The lawyer hesitated. Financial matters. A chill ran down Haley's spine. She had always assumed that her father had been forced to close the restaurant because of Alexander's company. But now, something wasn't adding up. Mr. Bennett had a few debts before he passed. The lawyer continued, and there was an agreement made with a private investor. Haley's pulse spiked. What kind of agreement? The lawyer sighed. One that involved your restaurant, and one that Alexander Reed tried to fix before you even knew who he was. Her heart stopped. Number? That couldn't be right. You're saying Alexander was trying to help me before I even met him? The lawyer was silent for a long moment. Then, yes, and I have proof. Haley felt like the ground beneath her had vanished. Everything she thought she knew, everything she thought had been true, was suddenly being torn apart. She needed to see Alexander. Now, the elevator dinged softly as Haley stepped into Alexander's penthouse. The city stretched out before her, lights flickering against the floor-to-ceiling windows. She found him standing by the bar, pouring himself a drink. He turned when he heard her. His eyes widened slightly. Haley? She didn't hesitate. She stormed forward, throwing the folder from the lawyer onto the counter. You knew, she said, her voice sharp. Alexander's jaw tightened. I did. Her chest tightened. Why didn't you tell me? Alexander exhaled slowly, setting his drink down. Because I knew you wouldn't trust me if I did. Haley's hands clenched into fists. You let me believe that your company was responsible for ruining my family's business, when the truth was, my father made a deal that went wrong. Alexander's gaze darkened. I wanted to fix it. I tried to fix it. She shook her head. Why? Silence. Then, because I couldn't stand watching you suffer. Her breath caught. Alexander stepped closer, his voice low. You think I didn't want to tell you? That I didn't want you to know the truth? His fingers grazed her wrist, the touch gentle. You already didn't trust me, Haley. And I was afraid that if I told you everything, I'd lose whatever little chance I had with you. Her heart was pounding now, because in his eyes, she saw something she hadn't let herself believe before. He wasn't lying. Alexander Reed, the billionaire, the powerful businessman, the man who could have had anything, had risked everything to fix her past, and not because he wanted control, not because he wanted credit, but because he wanted her. Her vision blurred. Say something, he murmured. She swallowed hard. I don't know what to say. Alexander's gaze dropped to her lips. You don't have to say anything. And then he kissed her. It wasn't like the other times. This wasn't a kiss out of frustration or out of anger. It was real, and it was everything. His lips moved against hers slowly, as if giving her time to pull away. But she didn't. She couldn't, because the moment his arms wrapped around her, the moment she felt the warmth of his body against hers, she knew. She had already fallen, and there was no turning back. When they finally pulled apart, Alexander pressed his forehead to hers, his breath ragged. I meant what I said, he whispered. Haley's fingers tightened against his shirt. And what's that? He tilted her chin up, his gray eyes intense. I don't want to lose you. Her heart ached, because she knew that she didn't want to lose him either. But wanting something and trusting it were two different things. And Haley wasn't sure if she was ready to take that risk. Not yet. She stepped back, her chest rising and falling quickly. I need time. Alexander's expression didn't change. He simply nodded. As long as you need, he said softly. Haley swallowed. Because even though she still had doubts, she knew one thing for certain. She was done running. And for the first time in a long time, she was ready to fight for what she wanted, even if that meant taking a risk on Alexander Reed. Haley had spent the last 72 hours replaying the moment in her mind. The kiss, the truth, the way Alexander had looked at her, like she was the only thing that mattered. And now, as she stood inside her family's empty restaurant, staring at the faded walls and dust-covered countertops, she knew she had a decision to make. Not just about the restaurant, not just about her future, but about him. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for something bigger, and it terrified her. Because what if she took the risk? What if she let herself believe in Alexander Reed, and he let her down? Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the name. Alexander. She hesitated. Then slowly she answered. Haley. His voice was smooth, warm. Are you busy tonight? She exhaled, leaning against the countertop. That depends. On? She smirked. Whether or not this involves you trying to convince me to forgive you. A low chuckle. Not exactly, he said. Though, I wouldn't mind if that happened either. She rolled her eyes. Meet me at the rooftop of the Fairmont Hotel, 8 p.m. Her stomach fluttered. Why? A pause. Because there's something I need to say, and I want to do it right. She swallowed. Alexander, please. His voice softened. Just come. Her fingers tightened around the phone. She should say no. She should protect herself. But instead, she found herself whispering, okay. And in that moment, she knew, no matter what happened tonight, no matter what he said, she was already all in. The elevator dinged softly as it reached the top floor of the Fairmont Hotel. Haley stepped out, her breath catching as she took in the sight before her. The rooftop had been transformed. Soft golden lights were strung across the space, casting a warm glow. A small, intimate table sat in the center, with candles flickering against the night sky. And standing there, in a perfectly tailored suit, hands in his pockets, was Alexander Reed. Her heart skipped. He turned when he saw her, his gray eyes dark and unreadable. You came, he murmured. She swallowed. You asked me to. A ghost of a smile. I wasn't sure if you would. She stepped closer. Neither was I. Dinner was different. Alexander wasn't teasing. He wasn't pushing. He was just there, listening, asking her about her plans for the restaurant, asking about Ethan, asking about her. And for the first time, Haley realized how much she had missed this, missed him. She set her fork down, studying him. You're being suspiciously well-behaved tonight. His lips curved slightly. You expected me to be worse? Usually you like a challenge. His gaze flickered. Maybe, he said, voice low. I've realized some things are worth waiting for. Her chest tightened. Alexander. But before she could say another word, he stood up, reaching into his pocket. Her breath caught, because in his hands was a small velvet box. Haley's pulse pounded. Before you say anything, Alexander said, his voice steady. Let me make one thing clear. She couldn't breathe. I know this is fast. I know I've done things that made you question me. But I also know that from the moment I met you, his lips curved slightly. From the moment you hugged me by accident, her throat tightened. I knew you were going to change my life. Her hands trembled. You don't have to say yes tonight, he continued. But I need you to know that this is real for me. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. I want you, Haley. Not just for a moment. Not just because of guilt or circumstances, but because I love you. Her breath shattered. Because no one had ever said those words to her like that before. With certainty, with no hesitation, with everything. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, because she was terrified of losing him, of not losing him, of feeling this much. Alexander exhaled slowly. You don't have to give me an answer, he murmured. She blinked. But his lips quirked. Just hold on to this. He gently placed the box in her hands. And when you're ready, I'll be waiting. Her chest ached, because somehow that was even worse than a direct proposal, because it meant the choice was completely hers. Hours later, Haley stood outside her apartment. The velvet box felt heavy in her hands. She had spent her whole life being cautious, never taking risks, never letting herself believe in something too good to be true. But maybe Alexander wasn't too good to be true. Maybe he was just good for her. And for the first time, she was ready to believe that. Her heart raced as she pulled out her phone. She typed 3 words. Hit send. And then she smiled. Because tonight, she had finally made up her mind. And she was ready. Would you take the risk of love, knowing it could change your life forever? Or would you walk away, afraid of getting hurt? Comment below. Do you think Haley should say yes, or should she take more time before making a decision? And don't forget, there's still one final chapter left. Will Alexander get his answer? Will Haley finally trust that she deserves happiness? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the emotional conclusion to their story. Because sometimes the best love stories don't start with a perfect moment. They start with a mistake.